This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. In our second of 4 podcasts of the Institute's first annual Military History Symposium entitled The Centenary of the Great War, A Canadian Perspective, Dr. Allan English of Queen's University speaks to us on the Canadian Corps' unseen enemy, battles against diseases of body and mind.
Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Allan English.
Thanks for that kind introduction, and I have to say, since you mentioned it, I actually joined the original RCAF, number 100821. I was told when I got that number from the young sergeant that remember that number, you'll have it for the rest of your life. And of course, by the time I graduated from RMC, they gave me a green uniform and a different number, so oh well. There you go. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, both as a speaker and as an RCMI member. I live in Kingston, so I don't get here very often, so it's a pleasure to come back. And I'd also like to thank Ryan Goldsworthy for inviting me and recognize his work as the curator of the museum. He's been kind enough to give me a little private tour from time to time, and I've been really admiring some of the work he's been done here. In fact, we had Canadian Institute of Military and Veterans Health Research colloquium here in conjunction with the Invictus Games, and we had a graduate student, what do they call it, networking session here, and I was showing them around and pointing to that wonderful Vickers machine gun there and the Lewis gun, saying, oh, it's pretty cool, huh? And they all went, wow. Along with, of course, the Richthofen seat, and nobody can miss that. I'd also like to recognize, Ryan is, of course, one of my former graduate students, as is Connor Kurtz, an intern, and I'd like to also recognize Matthew Barrett. Just wave your hand there, Matthew. He's one of my PhD students right now. Matthew's work is on suicides in the Canadian military, historical perspectives, starting the First World War and up to today, as well as concepts of honor and dishonor. We're working through, I'm just reading his chapters now in the First World War, and the idea of court-martial and cashiering and dismissal with disgrace and whatnot. So Matt will be around at supper time or buffet time, so feel free if you've got questions, you want to talk to him. He'd be more than happy to talk to you about those issues, which I'll mention maybe incidentally. Okay, so I probably should say to start with that this presentation has bits and pieces that can be a little graphic and is for mature audiences only, but looking out over this audience, I think we'll be okay. But I do want to warn you, there'll be some bits that might be a little disturbing. So my topic involves an enemy that throughout history, military forces have and will always battle, lest it cause more casualties than combat. And that enemy is disease. And unless military forces fight it well and without let-up, it can decide a campaign before the first shot is fired. And so today I'm going to sort of segue into that last question that was asked, so do we have any lessons for today? Well, actually, what I'm going to try and do is fit the Canadian Corps' experience into the longer history of the military battle against disease. So this is just a slide that is a quick illustration of the real issue here. And this is that in every conflict prior to 1914, there were between 2 and 10 times the number of soldiers dying from disease as dying from battle wounds. Therefore, until the 20th century, war was always a medical catastrophe for combatants, civilians, and societies. And note that this slide just shows the number of deaths. We don't have reliable information on how many non-fatal casualties and hospitalizations occurred due to disease. And just quickly, I may just raise my voice here, but you can see that the numbers vary, and it's not necessarily related to the state of medical technology or medical knowledge. And that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about is sometimes you see documentaries and whatnot that have the hypothesis that as medical knowledge and technology and whatnot improves, that casualties decrease. And what we're going to see is that's not the case. One of the worst cases in history, documented by my colleague Rob Engen, was the 1809 British expedition to Walcheren near Amsterdam in the Netherlands. The amphibious assault was initially successful, but the force was wiped out by preventable disease, with 37 disease deaths for every one battle casualty. 37 to 1. And this was caused an enormous scandal that brought down the British government and, of course, ended that campaign rather ignominiously. Now, Walcheren was a result of corruption, incompetence, and just general malfeasance all along. The parliamentary inquiry brought that out. But that being said, militaries were not helpless in the face of disease. In fact, even though they didn't have any idea about germ theory, since at least the early 18th century, there were basic principles of sanitation, hygiene, and disease prevention that military physicians and military commanders had worked out through trial and error. Sir John Pringle was a leading 18th century expert on public health, and his colleagues' works were published widely. But their books were only rarely read by officers in the field, and doctors could only give advice. Commanders had to follow it if it was going to be effective. Enlightened commanders like James Wolfe read these works and followed their recommendations religiously. This enabled Wolfe to minimize non-battle casualties by insisting that best practices in hygiene be employed, and he also ensured they were diligently carried out, because he knew that disease could cause catastrophic losses before battle was joined. However, one of the reasons medical disasters like Walcheren occurred is that not only were British senior officers unaware, or many British officers, senior officers, unaware of best public health practices, but they mocked leaders like Wolfe who tried to implement and enforce them. And this caricature of Wolfe is by one of his own brigadiers during the Quebec campaign, and it's making fun of the fact that it's beneath the dignity of a senior officer to be inspecting latrines. But in fact, Wolfe did, to make sure that they weren't causing preventable diseases. And the attitude, unfortunately, of Brigadier Townsend and his like has not gone away. And as we'll see, even in the Canadian Forces today, there are commanders that do not fully appreciate the problems with not paying attention to disease. However, the turning point occurred in the First World War, and Canadians were at the forefront in reducing preventable casualties through what we call force health protection today. So it's often called a turning point in military medicine, where for the first time in history, there are fewer casualties from disease than from battle. And the figures vary, but among the nation in the First World War, among nations with first-class medical services like Canada, the numbers were basically the reverse of the South African War. That is, 2 soldiers dying from battle wounds versus 1 from disease. And you can see some pretty remarkable Canadian figures here, where the death rate by disease is just 1%, which is amazing when you compare it to the past. Even more remarkable to some people is this medical miracle that almost 90% survive their wounds. And this is pre-antibiotic days. And that 4 out of 5 were returned to active service. And those figures are unprecedented in history. And we also have to take into account that this wasn't just due to advances in medicine, but in all the supporting trades and occupations and professions such as nursing, rehabilitation and occupational therapy, And I would say most importantly, under the control of the Director of Medical Services, is the sanitation officer, who was in charge of what they called the sanitary police. And they would go around and check and make sure that all the public health, force health protection methods were being carried out, and they had the same authority as military police, okay? So they could arrest people if they were found to be negligent or not doing their duty. And this was one of the reasons why the Canadian Corps had such an amazing record. It just wasn't the fact that they had good procedures, but they actually rigorously enforced them. However, as effective as Canada's medical services were at minimizing casualties from disease, our losses were still unprecedented both then and now. And as you can see from this summary here, it's the greatest in relation to our population in our history. You can just imagine what those losses would have been like if the Canadian military had suffered disease casualties equal even to the historically low rate of the South African War. Now, I put together this last figure just to show people today the effect this had on Canadian society. I mean, virtually every Canadian family knew someone that had been wounded or injured during the war. It had a huge effect on everything from pensions to medical care. In fact, people say that the origins of Medicare in Canada and the National Health Program were in fact in the First World War, when our doctors who had been practicing as individuals went over and served in uniform and found out how important public health was, some of them for the first time in their lives. So many things came out of the First World War. And I would say for today's generation, particularly for younger people, you just put in context, just imagine we had approximately 2,000 casualties in Afghanistan that's wounded and killed. And if we'd had casualties, the scale of the First World War, it would have been 1 million. And you can just imagine what effect that would have had on our society. And that's the effect it had on Canadian society in 1918 and in the interwar years. So I'm now going to start the story of the battle against disease with the ones that are most often discussed in the medical history. For example, typhoid and paratyphoid fevers, known together as the enteric fevers at the time, which were diseases of the intestines. They had long been a disease associated with military campaigns, and as late as the South African War, they ravaged military forces, largely due to inadequate sanitation in camps, going back to our sanitation police. In the early 20th century, vaccines were developed against typhoid, and while fairly new, they were widely available in 1914. However, at that time, much like today, there were those who opposed mandatory vaccination, and there was fear about the side effects of vaccination in some parts of the population, as you can see here. The result was that not all armies in the First World War followed or enforced mandatory vaccination policies. And for those at the back, in case you can't see, I like this slide, compulsory vaccination German board. That's why we can't do it in Canada. It's a German thing. So in 1919, that's obviously bad. Okay, the examples you see here show how vaccination policies affected losses due to disease in 4 armies. The French army had a policy based on public opinion in France that mandatory vaccination was unnecessary, and as a result, only a small number of French soldiers were inoculated against typhoid in 1914. As a result, in 1914 and 1915, the French army suffered, as you see there, 125,000 cases of preventable typhoid fever during a serious outbreak, and had nearly 15,000 deaths from typhoid before, guess what, the French instituted mandatory vaccinations in 1915. And you can imagine in those tense days of that part of the war how much that loss was felt. Now, the Italian army is interesting because it had, in theory, a policy of mandatory vaccination, but it was poorly enforced. And so they had fairly large losses. The British, much more rigorous, and you can see the losses are much less. And of course, the Canadians had some of the most rigorous mandatory vaccination policies among all the combatants, enforced from the very beginning, with medical and military authorities deciding to put public health ahead of public opinion. And let's see, a total of 16 deaths throughout the war to typhoid. Compare that to the French of 15,000. And that's not because the vaccine wasn't available, it was because of the policies controlling its use. The Canadian approach reflected a new philosophy in military medicine, but one that is widely accepted and practiced today, namely that health service workers in uniform must put the health of the organization ahead of the health of any one individual. But even with these advances in military public health, there were still major outbreaks of communicable disease. And the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 is probably the best known, as it infected 500 million people across the world and resulted in the deaths of 50 to 100 million, 3 to 5% of the world's population. Yet, as catastrophic as these figures are worldwide, there was another rarely discussed disease that caused more casualties in the Canadian Expeditionary Force than the flu pandemic. This family of diseases, called sexually transmitted infections today, was referred to as venereal disease by the medical profession at the time, and I'll use both terms today. To put these numbers in context, the losses to VD were equivalent to almost the entire strength of the 4 divisions that comprised the Canadian Corps in the field. Early on in the war, there was little sympathy for VD sufferers, and at first they were discharged from the Army. However, by 1916, the manpower crisis compelled the CEF to retain what it called its venereals and treat them in 2 specially created hospitals. Before the days of antibiotics, the treatment for VD with arsenic and mercury compounds could be exceedingly painful, and this was seen at the time as especially appropriate in a treatment program designed to be punitive and cautionary. VD sufferers were segregated, they had their pay stopped, and subsequent pension claims were often denied because residual symptoms were so varied. And if you're interested in the full story of this, just recently, Canadian Military History, which is an online open access journal, you can look it up right now with your internet connection. There's a story, an article that's just out on VD treatment in the Canadian military hospitals in 1916. It's a great background, gives you all the details if you're interested in it. There was also, by the way, a social problem here because when Canadian mothers and wives were wondering sometimes why their husband or son's pay had been stopped and they weren't getting their allowances. There were some very embarrassing conversations that went on, so eventually they disregarded that policy and didn't stop pay. However, it was soon realized by some that prevention was better than cure, and Canadian medical officers recommended a proactive program of prevention and early treatment. But at the time, sex was a taboo subject, and the Canadian Expeditionary Force medical officers' proposals were met by fierce resistance from many military chaplains, clergy at home, politicians, and some senior officers, particularly in the British Army, who saw the proposed attempts to prevent VD as promoting immorality among the troops. These proponents were prepared to forego preventative measures because they believed that these measures would promote moral laxity. However, their policies, or lack thereof, resulted in extremely high infection rates in units where they were followed. The Canadian Army, unlike the British Army, adopted a proactive strategy to reduce VD casualties, including an extensive sex education program, distribution of condoms, and early treatment in blue light stations located near red light areas in London, Paris, and elsewhere. In the end, most Canadian medical officers at the time took what they call a practical view in dealing with VD, and they ignored arguments against their policies based on religious beliefs as well as existing laws which prohibited even information about contraceptives being distributed, let alone distributing contraceptives themselves. And there's some great stories that come out. Actually, I like to read some of the obituaries of veterans of the wars, particularly the Second World War. The great one about a Royal Navy medical officer who said, it's real irony here. Here I am lecturing the sailors on, STIs and handing out condoms. He said, at home, in my own practice, I can't even counsel a married couple on contraception without breaking the law. And that law, by the way, was finally expunged from the books in, believe it or not, 1969. Up until 1969, it was still illegal in Canada for a medical doctor to counsel even married couples about contraception. Largely ignored, mind you, but it was still on the books. So this is what the doctors were dealing with. On one hand at home, it was totally taboo. But when they got overseas, they thought, we've got to solve this problem. We've got to take a practical approach to medicine. And so when I said earlier about social change that the First World War generates, this is one of the examples. Another category of disease also took its toll on the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and although it was widely discussed and reported in the media, it was a problem that, unlike typhoid fever or even VD, was extremely difficult to deal with because of assumptions about mental illness that were deeply ingrained in Western culture, many of which remain today. In this discussion, I will sometimes use the term widely used by those dealing with mental health issues in the Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Affairs Canada today, operational stress injury, or OSI, because it encompasses a wide variety of mental health issues and is not limited to narrow clinical diagnoses such as PTSD. So OSIs are not a new phenomenon. Since biblical times, dealing with stress in soldiers has been recognized as a serious problem that military leaders had to deal with to improve the chances of success in battle. The ancient Israelites knew that fear could be contagious, and the officers of their army were directed to speak to their soldiers, as you see here. Their leaders also exempted from their armies those who were about to be married, those who had just built a house, or those who had just planted a vineyard. These people were temporarily excused from combat because their leaders understood that such people would probably feel the effects of the stress of battle more acutely than their comrades, and if they broke down, they would adversely affect the morale of their comrades. The earliest antecedent to operational stress in the medical literature can be found in an article by Johannes Hofer, published in 1678. He described a disease that afflicted Swiss mercenaries serving in France who exhibited these symptoms. Unless the soldiers could be returned home, they sometimes died or went mad. Hofer's clear description of these cases led to the acceptance by the medical profession of nostalgia as a recognizable disease of soldiers serving far from their homes based on what Hofer saw as its most conspicuous symptom. The diagnosis of nostalgia was widely used by the medical profession until the First World War, when dramatic changes took place in the diagnosis and treatment of non-physical battle casualties. Many of the changes occurred after the First Battle of the Somme in July 1916, when several thousand soldiers had to be withdrawn from battle due to nervous disorders. Many of these were permanently lost to the military because they were evacuated far from the front line and given conventional treatments in hospitals, often back in Britain, a practice that was eventually discontinued, as we shall see. Now, this slide gives an example from a Canadian perspective of the costs of psychological casualties to military organizations. Although for reasons which I will describe next, the numbers significantly underestimate the true effect. As you can see by this statement by one of Canada's senior medical officers in the First World War, the question of how to name or diagnose symptoms that had been identified in the medical literature for over 200 years was still unresolved. This led to a multitude of diagnoses and treatments being tried, such as electrode shock therapy, hot and cold baths, massage, daily marches, athletic activities, hypnosis, and mainly for officers, talk therapy that was sometimes called psychoanalysis. These many approaches to treating operational stress can be explained by the fact that while the symptoms of stress reported in the medical literature have been relatively constant over time, how they were interpreted varied widely, depending on the culture of the military force, the national culture in which that force existed, and the paradigms or frameworks that were used at any given time. And if you're looking for a really good book on this topic, I recommend Ethan Waters' Crazy Like Us, and it's an explanation of how the American interpretations of these symptoms with the diagnostic and statistical manuals 1 through 5 have really set a standard for the world that in many cases is dysfunctional. In general terms, these are the major paradigms that have been used to interpret the causes of operational stress injury over the years. This depiction is an oversimplification, but it illustrates the extremes and the middle point in the debate. For example, in the First World War, the French Army used the term blessure commotionnelle and blessure émotionnelle to name the two extremes, roughly translated as physical shock injuries and emotional shock injuries. During the First World War, the physical paradigm dominated, and in the Second World War, the psychological paradigm was dominant. But during both wars, divisive debates among members of the medical community were papered over by the deliberate use of vague terms for many psychological problems. There's a few here. I just wanted to point out, actually, is something that's come up rather well, I suppose, in the last 10 years or so. I was at a conference, I think Deer Lodge Hospital in Winnipeg. I guess it was about 2004, and they were just starting to look into MTBI, minor traumatic brain injury. And so nowadays they refer to MTBI and TBI. And with exposure to concussive, the effects of exposure to concussive explosions with some of our forces in the Middle East with IEDs and other ways, they've started doing MRIs and other imaging of brains and found out that, guess what? Those concussive effects, as we know now from sports athletes, actually do have slight damage to the brain. And to me, it's sort of an irony that shell shock, which first appeared in the medical literature in 1916 when they drew some spinal fluid from those suffering from some sort of mental illness and found blood in the spinal fluid, the hypothesis was that the concussive shock of the shells had damaged the brain. By about 1939-40, that was largely dismissed. And guess what? It's back again, that it actually does happen. So that's why I sort of believe in the cyclical approach to history. It's not linear. Things that we knew come back again to either inform us or bite us, whether we're aware of them or not. Okay, with those terms there, in the First World War, the diagnosis of disordered action of the heart, DAH, they just shortened it down because they used it so often, was a label that placed the patient in the physical, not psychological disease category. It was applied to many soldiers by medical officers to avoid the stigma of diagnoses such as the standard diagnoses being hysteria, neurasthenia, or hysterical conversion symptom. That's a wonderful one. By the way, Romeo Dallaire was actually diagnosed, he told me, with hysterical conversion syndrome the first time. And all of this was documented in the report of the War Office Committee of the Inquiry into Shell Shock, published in 1922, where numerous medical officers testified that they would not diagnose people with a mental illness because it would stigmatize them, so instead they marked them DAH. And that goes back to the point I made before. If you're looking through medical records and you're looking for psychological injuries, you can't just look at ones that were identified as psychological injuries at the time, because the medical officers have told us that they actually deliberately made the diagnosis as DAH, so it does complicate our research. The Canadian and British services eventually coined the term NYDN, not yet diagnosed nervous. In fact, the British actually built NYDN hospitals between the wars, anticipating that strategic bombing was going to cause a lot of casualties. And this term was in widespread use at the end of the First World War until the beginning of the Second World War to minimize stigma and to obscure the sharp disagreement of various specialists over how to name and categorize the diseases. Despite the disagreements among specialists, Commonwealth military medical authorities agreed to a standard frontline treatment regime that by 1918 was widely used by their forces and eventually adopted by the American forces when they came into the war eventually. It was so effective that its basis for present-day treatment of OSIs near the front line is exactly that, using these principles of proximity, immediacy, expectancy, and simplicity. And the return rate using this PIES treatment varies, but it's between 70 and 90%. Whereas people that are evacuated to the rear, the farther back they get, the less chance there is that they'll return. And those evacuated to the far rear into what they did at first into psychiatric hospitals, there's a 10 to 20% return rate at best. So this forward return rate was actually used as a force health protection method, but also to return people to combat. So as I promised, I want to look a little bit at some of the implications of what I've been talking about. We've seen that the First World War marked the beginning of the era where it was possible to reduce casualties lost to diseases of mind and body significantly. These are casualties often referred to today as preventable casualties because health services have the tools to reduce personnel wastage from them to a minimum. So in the last part of my presentation, I'm going to discuss how the lessons learned in the First World War are still applicable now and in the future. Now, as you see here, even in the 21st century, Western militaries can suffer unnecessary losses when they neglect lessons that were learned 100 years ago. In each of these cases, preventative measures from adequate sanitation to prophylaxis like anti-malarial drugs to vaccination were neglected by the chain of command despite objections from medical officers, with the severe losses you see here. So I'm going to get back to this one, but you can see that in the Burma campaign, the British Army had an incredible sick to wounded rate. U.S. forces in Vietnam, they weren't taking their malaria meds. Same thing here with the U.S. Marines in Liberia. 95% didn't take their protective meds properly. They blamed it on the doctors, by the way. More on that later. And then our very own mess up, and I'll mention General J.R. Bernier. Later he was a student of mine at Canadian Forces College on an advanced course with Surgeon General of the Canadian Forces. He was the head of health protection or part of the health protection branch then. They recommended the required prophylaxis, and the Canadian leadership didn't think it was important enough to implement. And so we have to this day people suffering from dengue fever and malaria because they didn't put screens on their buildings. Needless to say, JR wasn't too happy about that. Since the First World War, good commanders knew that healthcare professionals were responsible for providing appropriate advice and care, but commanding officers were responsible for the overall health of their subordinates. Actually, we can go back to Wolfe's time, he knew that. For example, Slim, who had commanded units in the First World War and who knew firsthand about these matters, fired regimental officers when diseases like malaria occurred again in units where it had previously been eradicated. So, under Slim's leadership, 14th Army's disease attrition rate dropped from 360 per 1,000 men per month in 1943 to 30 per 1,000 in 1945, a tenfold decrease. And that it had nothing to do with the medical advice or the drugs. It was all about ensuring that the advice of the medical officers was carried out and firing people that didn't. Yet testimony before the Board of Inquiry of Croatia in 1999 revealed in the 1990s that most Canadian Forces leaders thought that medical professionals were responsible for the health of their units. And this is part of the reason for unnecessary casualties that we've seen. Just returning to one we don't like to talk about, the case of STIs can still be controversial, even in Western militaries, as its cultural dimensions are sometimes interfering with best medical practices. Nevertheless, following in the footsteps of their predecessors, Canadian healthcare professionals in Afghanistan made condoms freely available to all personnel, even though sexual activity was officially prohibited when deployed in the theater of operations. Interestingly, for my talk today, is that a defense spokesperson justified this practice using the precedent set by Canadian military doctors in the First World War. So I guess he'd been reading his history. Unlike diseases of the body, diseases of the mind, and related mental health issues are in some ways as intractable as they were 100 years ago. For example, there is still significant stigma attached to OSIs, especially in the military, despite all their efforts to eradicate it. And this stigma often discourages military personnel from seeking help. And you can also see here from these reports that despite all the reports and recommendations and the knowledge that's been put forward, the Canadian Armed Forces has been slow in implementing recommendations to reduce the rate of OSIs. And so we now get to the interesting question, why might this be so? We're in the 21st century, we have the recommendations, some of the knowledge has been around for 100 years, why is it that it isn't implemented? Well, I'll use this little picture here to illustrate the point. The expression tooth to tail ratio is often used to rationalize cuts to non-essential, that is support, parts of the CAF. And this image might for some represent the ideal metaphor for the CAF. Sometimes the term operations primacy is used to argue that, quote, operational priorities, unquote, should always take precedence over, quote, institutional imperatives, unquote. Institutional imperatives like, force health protection. And this was actually in an article that the Chief of the Defense Staff, General Vance, recently wrote in Canadian Military Journal. And he was actually referring to Operation Honor and some of the issues dealing with that. But his point was that he recognized that what he called operational priorities take precedence over institutional imperatives. Now, this is the fallacy of the tooth to tail metaphor. For example, General Andrew Leslie's 2011 report on transformation called for more teeth and less tail in the CF, assuming that it is always preferable to make cuts to the tail of the CF. For example, support functions, including medical services, instead of its teeth. And by the way, at the Simvar conference, I ran into Commodore Hans Jung, who was the Surgeon General when these cuts were made. And he actually, exercising his privilege as Surgeon General, went directly to the Chief of the Defense Staff to complain about the cuts, because they were actually, because of the budget cuts that were supposed to be 10% across the board, going to make massive cuts to the Canadian Forces health protection capability. This is 2011. And he managed to get some of the cuts held off, but they were transferred elsewhere in the system. So, you know, health protection or health services still had to come up with their 10%. So going back to our saber-toothed tiger there, even this toothy predator has more than just a teeth and a tail. And the flawed logic in this metaphor is clear when we consider that all higher order animals are composed of a complex biological system that includes a brain, nervous system, cardiovascular system, digestive, and, immune systems, like force health protection. Consequently, when considering cuts to make to the CF, we might frame the question in the way you see it in the second point there. So I'll leave the last word before my conclusions to a Canadian who is one of the world's leading authorities on what we call force health protection. That is, those policies and practices designed to minimize preventable casualties. I mentioned J.R. Bernier before. He emphasizes the importance of history in reminding us of the necessity to pay constant attention to measures to reduce preventable losses and the regrettable but predictable habit of militaries to forget their past and then incur unnecessary personnel wastage. By the way, J.R.'s undergrad degree was in history, so I guess that's why he appreciated that. So no matter how effective medical or pharmaceutical intervention can be, compliance with disease prevention measures is always determined by the creation of systems of knowledge, efficient organizations, command responsibility, and above all, good leadership. And altogether, there's the technical side of force health protection. This is the human behavior side of force health protection that is often ignored, but actually our predecessors in the First World War knew about. So these are my final conclusions. The success of the Canadian Corps, the shock army of the British Empire, as Shane Schreiber called it, was due to many factors: mastery of battlefield tactics, applying the latest technology effectively due to its ability to exploit all learning opportunities, and excellent leadership. However, a little known but vital part of its success was its ability to minimize unnecessary casualties through the comprehensive application and enforcement of best practices in public health to force health protection methods. It achieved a high standard that the Canadian Armed Forces in the late 20th and early 21st century has not always met. And it's probably another good reason, as J.R. Bernier would say, to study our history. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Dr. English?
Thank you very much. Indeed, the First World War was a great tragedy for humanity, and we should do everything we can to prevent such tragedies from breaking out again. Yes. Okay. So my question is, I apologize if this is a little bit unrelated to your research, but World War II is great to study. World War I is great to study because we have so many documents as well as diaries from the soldiers, and from those diaries we hear about rats and rodents as big as cats sometimes roaming the trenches and migrating across the trenches. Could you explain or elaborate very briefly on what kind of health hazards the rodents presented, and as well as how we got over those challenges?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, they talk about vermin in general because it's more than rats. It's all sorts of things. It can be insects. It can be all sorts of small mammals. But basically, yeah, they often carry things like lice and fleas that transmit diseases. So the way actually you minimize them, you can never do away with them. I mean, the First World War was incredible, especially with all the the corpses that were unburied. But first of all, it's sanitation, and that's why the Canadians had sanitation police. You clean the garbage up. You don't leave it around. You absolutely minimize anything that might attract them. And then, knowing that they're going to be there anyway, you vaccinate against communicable diseases. So they're often referred to as disease vectors. So you can never eliminate all the disease vectors, even today. Mosquitoes, you can't eliminate them. So, you put up screens, you vaccinate, you give people medications, you make sure that the troops get back to get cleaned up from time to time. You have regular medical inspections. And actually, it's a good question, because when you think about the horrible conditions that the Canadian troops faced in the First World War, and to have a 1% death from disease rate, I mean, whatever they did, and that's something I should mention, is we don't really have a good medical history of the Canadian Armed Force or the Canadian military in the First World War. McPhail's is sort of a rebuttal of Herbert Bruce's attack on the medical corps, so it's interesting, but it's more of a polemic. We're still waiting for a really good history of the medical services. What we did. The Americans have like about 20 volumes, and they were only in the war for a year and a half. So anyway, let me just say that what the Canadians did is they took the advice of their public health experts, and they reduced every possible way that people could be infected, and then if people got infected, they treated them as well as they could.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Welcome.
It's more of an anecdote than a question. I hope you'll indulge me. The policy in the First World War, certainly initially in the British forces towards desertion, would be diagnosed as cowardice rather than taking into other possibilities, and of course the result was execution. And this was, to our everlasting shame, imposed on the Canadian Expeditionary Force as well. But my understanding, and I've read this in several locations, so I hope it's true, is that when Haig approached the General Officer commanding the Australians, Sir John Monash, and told him that would be expected in the Australian Army, I understand that Monash's answer was to the words or the effect of, how much notice do you need, because we're going home. I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, actually, there's an excellent book out by Teresa Iacobelli. Remind me, Matt? Death or Deliverance, yeah. And Matt, Teresa came to Queens and spoke, and Matt probably remembers, his young brain remembers more than mine, but Teresa did a wonderful book looking at all the court-martial records and found that, do you remember how many Canadians were executed for?
There's 25 that were executed, and that's 90% of all the execution sentences that were passed were eventually commuted. So there were about 300 or so execution sentences that were passed against Canadians, and only 10% were carried out.
And so, I mean, the Canadians were sort of between the Australians and the British. And actually, if you read Teresa's book, which I highly recommend, you'll find out that the people that were executed, for the most part, though not entirely, were multiple offenders. In other words, they'd been sentenced to death or long periods of imprisonment. They'd been sent back to fight because they didn't want to, their sentence has been commuted and sent back to fight, and they committed more heinous crimes. And so, you really start reading her book and the court-martial records of some of the ones that were executed, and it was like, wow, were they ever patient? So the thing was, the Canadians did follow a lot of the British practices, and there were clearly people that were unfairly treated, but the Canadians tried to mitigate those policies as much as possible. And not everyone, of course, who deserted was a coward or suffering from mental illness. I mean, there were clearly cases where people admitted that they were just going back to, get drunk or see a girlfriend. So it's a complicated story, but I highly recommend Teresa's book. It'll clarify a lot.
It might be reassuring to learn that in 2004, in the Royal Canadian Dragoons camp in Bosnia, there was an outbreak, a serious outbreak of gastrointestinal disease, and then Colonel Dean Milner actually posted regimental police at the entrance to the cafeteria, and we were watched washing our hands for about 2 weeks until that went away. So the enforcement was real. But as a question, Sir Andrew MacPhail, I think on the very page of the paragraph you cited, famously essentially dismissed OSIs as having any validity whatsoever. And that was in 1925, and I wonder what effect you could see in Canadian society as a whole in accepting what must have been hordes of guys who were pretty screwed up by 1925.
Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, just on the hand washing thing, I don't know if any of you have read the book Fob Doc. It's about a doctor who is at a forward operating base in Afghanistan. And he said, the most effective thing I could do as an MD, is stand outside the mess hall with my hand sanitizer and make sure that everybody washed their hands. So, yeah, that's a great question. And basically, Canadian society was torn over the issue. There were huge debates going on at the time. If you read the psychological and psychiatric literature from 1919 through to 39, massive debates. And MacPhail is part of that group of people that basically think, people that show symptoms of mental illness are weak. And this goes back to the old sort of moral treatment when mental illness was considered to be a lack of character, lack of moral fiber, and people just needed to buck up and get on with it. He was very much of that school. There was also the problem that by 1938, the second biggest line item in Canada's budget, aside from the national debt, was veterans' pensions. And shell shock was over 50%, I've forgotten the exact number, of those pensions. So here you are in the throes of the depression that's still hanging on, and people who have lost everything look at people who are apparently physically well. They've got sympathy for the wounded veterans with physical wounds, but see people who are being pensioned for shell shock, who are apparently quite well, drawing pensions, and it causes huge sort of reaction against the whole shell shock thing. It's a hugely controversial book. One that's just come out, by the way, is Adam Montgomery's The Invisible Injured, just published this year by McGill Queen's University Press. I highly recommend it. Good summary of First World War up to today. Is particularly strong from 1980 on, where it documents the strengths and weaknesses of the Canadian Forces treatment of mental health injuries. But yeah, even to this day, there's no agreement. I was called to a meeting in 2000 at Petawawa, and this was the first step the Canadian Armed Forces was going to make to try and get a grip on the recommendations of the Board of Inquiry Croatia, which had said that, hey, the problems aren't being caused by contaminated soil, which was the first hypothesis, that the behavioral issues were caused by contaminated soil. It's actually being caused by stress. And actually, that quote that I had from the Bible there was part of a report that I did for the board. So anyway, I was invited just to give a historical perspective. So I don't know how they did it, but they got 5 psychiatrists in the room to give us some background on it. They almost came to blows, seriously. Today, 21st century, there were those that believed completely in talk therapy. There were others that were hard over on drug therapy and everything in between. And actually, if you go to Simbar, back in September, yeah, there's certain groups that are in one corner and certain groups in the other corner. So even today, there are strong disagreements. And don't bring in the psychologists, because when I was at the Deer Lodge conference, a psychologist got up and gave a paper on MTBI and how psychologists were treating MTBI, and a psychiatrist immediately got up and said, we're taking clinical leadership here. You can't have clinical leadership. You're not MDs. And I'm thinking, wow, that's a psychiatrist? Maybe they should be seeing somebody for anger management. But, anyway, I leave it with that. There's a lot of disagreement in the field.
One more question.
Sure.
about 20 years ago, I heard the word mefloquine come up in relationship to the American Army, and I heard it again just recently. And I'm wondering what the Canadian Armed Forces approach is to mefloquine.
Well, let me give you a personal anecdote. When I was an air navigator on 436 Squadron in Trenton, whenever we went into malarial areas, which wasn't often, we were told that, well, we know the Army guys take mefloquine, but you guys can't because you're air crew. Well, why is that? Well, we're not going to talk about it. So we took chloroquine and primaquine, but we had to take lots of pills regularly. And so what it came out is what they chose for the Army, because they're in the field, is they wanted a prophylactic that they could take once a week. Not like 2 pills a day. It was, I take all sorts of stuff. So the problem with mefloquine, and it's been in the press, I haven't really gone into the studies, but the Armed Forces has admitted that in the 90s, they did an unsanctioned clinical trial using mefloquine. There have been lots of reports. Let me just say, a lot of debate in the armed forces about it. To date, I think the latest policy on it is they will not prescribe it unless the person can't take anything else, because both the United States and Britain have said that it does cause, in some people, psychological upset. So this is another one of those debates that here we are in the 21st century. We know it all? No, we don't. So great question. Thanks.
Did we learn anything from the enemy in the First World War and the Second World War? I asked that question because I read once that the great German World War, I'm talking about one medical secret of World War I, was the bare salicylic tablet, and that the trench commanders were under orders to destroy all supplies if they thought their trench was going to give away, and that helped the German health enormously and helped in the flu epidemic that followed the war.
Oh, that's a new one to me. So if you've got any references on that, I'd be happy to see them. But actually, it is of interest that Sigmund Freud was, of course, a citizen of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his students practiced medicine with the Austro-Hungarian army. And if you read, I think, volume 17 of his memoirs, you'll see that he had to revise a lot of his theories on mental illness being largely caused by sexual repression, because his students were reporting all these cases in the Austro-Hungarian army, and it clearly had nothing to do with sex. So he comes up with 2 new theories of mental illness after that. But I'm not aware of any great breakthroughs on the enemy side. Nope.
Thank you, Dr. English.
Oh, thank you.
This has been another in the series of podcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find notices of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives on our website at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the Institute, this is Eric Morse saying please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for listening.